It's lovely to see so many friends and comrades here. It's great. So this event is sponsored and hosted by the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies at SFU, whose director, Adel Iskandar, continues to work tirelessly to cultivate scholarship and organize academic and community events focused on a wide range of issues pertaining to Palestine, the Middle East, West Asia, and settler colonial polities such as the one we are in here. Yeah. Oh, I thought I heard applause for Adel. Much deserved. And I'd also like to thank Kylie Broderick, the coordinator of CCMS, for her unending work in organizing many important events over the last while. And for her help in organizing Nasser's visit. And finally, I'd also like to thank the Geography Department at UBC, which has also stepped up to co-sponsor this event. So before I introduce Nasser, I want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish First Nations. Unceded is a word used by the British from the late 18th century to articulate and document the refusal of Indigenous peoples in North America to accept the theft of their lands by settlers. According to the OED online, it's a word formed by English by derivation, unceded. It means territory that has not been given up or surrendered to settlers. When thinking about where this word comes from and how it comes into being, we can think about what it precludes, narrowing down Indigenous modes of inhabitation, to borrow a term that Nasser will talk to us about, but narrowing down Indigenous modes of inhabitation to a question of whether they had given over their lands to settlers or not. But it also points quite directly to the long history of refusal of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations to accept the theft of their lands. Refusal that persists in our present moment and is seen in the assertion of many Coast Salish peoples' political autonomy and jurisdiction over their lands and waters. And this political refusal includes a steadfast rejection of the Canadian state's ongoing support for the genocide of Palestinians. Refusal is, of course, a necessary precondition for meaningful solidarity. And so I just briefly want to recall some examples of this solidarity. On December 7th, 2023, the Assembly of First Nations passed an emergency resolution calling for a permanent ceasefire in Palestine and recognized Palestinians as Indigenous. The Red Nation issued a statement of solidarity with Palestinians, and at nearly every demonstration on these unceded lands, a member of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, or Musqueam First Nations has spoken in support of a ceasefire, an end to the occupation, and in support of the self-determination rights of Palestinians. Early on in this current intensification of genocidal violence, on October 28, 2023, Celia Joseph, who is Squamish and Nanaimo First Nations on her father's side and British Jewish on her mother's side, delivered her love letter to Palestine, her love letter to Palestinians at a demo. She spoke of the importance of bearing witness and recounted how in her community you can be called on to speak to what you have witnessed long into the future. The act of bearing witness contains an implicit responsibility to your community. And I think Joseph's welcoming of Palestinians to the lands of the Squamish was also an act of sovereignty. Refusal is one of the many political concepts and modes of praxis that Nasser Abourahme so incisively explores in his brilliant book, The Time Beneath the Concrete, Palestine Between Camp and Colony, which of course was just published by Duke and which was awarded the DUP Scholars of Color First Book Award. So congratulations, Nasser. So a very brief introduction to Nasser. He is a writer and teacher and currently assistant professor at Bowdoin College. He works broadly between colonial history and political theory, with a focus on questions of borders and migration, encampment and carcerality, settler colonialism and race, revolution and revolt, Marxism and the anti-colonial tradition, and of course, the question of Palestine. Nasser's writing can be found in places like Critical Times, Radical Philosophy, and Cultural Critique, and most recently, he co-edited with Aiko Day a special issue of the journal Critical Ethnic Studies called Palestine After Analogy. And if you haven't read it, I really recommend that to you as well. So please join me in welcoming Nasser. It's a huge pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. And I should add my thanks to Adil and to Kylie and for bringing me out here. And a special thanks to Brenna, of course, not just for the invite, but because her work has been so foundational to this entire project. So I'm very grateful and happy to pay it back, as it were, ever so slightly. Okay. And thank you all, of course, for being here today. What I want to talk about, or what I'm going to try to do, is just sort of present some of the big ideas in the book. I think some of the main arguments of the book, and then I'll try to present a sort of fragment of one chapter in the book. So I'm just going to speak sort of at you for a little while, and then I'm going to read a little bit just so that I don't have to pretend that I can do it all off the cuff. But I want to begin with the genocide. I want to begin with the genocide because there's really no other place to begin. I don't mean that just personally and ethically. That is, I don't mean that just because it consumes sort of every moment of my conscious life and probably my unconscious life, but I also mean it politically and intellectually. Because what I'm talking about in the book in terms of the conquest of time, settler colonialism, the persistence of Palestinian life and the camps are really the historical and structural conditions of the genocide. The only way to really understand how, in my reading at least, the only way to really understand how we get to this obliterating level of almost hysterical violence in Palestine is to think about the structural contradictions of Zionism as a settler colonial project that faces this long, possibly single arc of refusal and resistance that it is just ultimately unable to defeat. And one way I think to think about this, or to sort of illustrate that, one way that I've been trying to think about it, is to think about two senses that percolate, or two insights that we often think about, at least in Palestine, with regards to the genocide. One insight says that the genocide is but the extension of the historical logic of Zionism. That is, insofar as elimination is the very condition of possibility for a Jewish state in Palestine, as it is for every other settler colony, then genocide as one form, as one mechanism of elimination, if you want, has always been there, at least as a latent force. And in this light, the Nakba, the sort of founding eliminatory violence of the state, which many have also, of course, thought about as a genocide, is a sort of single unfolding sequence in time. And it carries with it always, at least, as I said, a latent return to that violence. And I think this is clear enough. It's clear enough in the Israeli rhetoric that explicitly incites the Nakba, not just as a sort of analytical frame, but in fact, increasingly as a rallying cry. As a rallying cry in vernacular Hebrew. So Nakba now, Nakba 2.0, the Gaza Nakba, and so on. There is, however, at the same time, on the other hand, I think an equally correct insight that will tell us that this genocide is unprecedented. That in terms of the sheer amount of destruction and death, that even if we take the conservative estimates of the Lancet, would have the death toll today of direct and indirect deaths at above 500,000. That in the sheer amount of sort of sadism and cruelty, or if you want, in the compulsive incitement to violence, in this sort of will to discourse that now it's reached a level in, or this sort of open call for the elimination of Gaza's children quite explicitly. In all of this, it's really new and unprecedented. So how do you reconcile these two readings? And as I said, I think two correct insights, that on the one hand, it's always been there, and on the other hand, it is also somehow new. And I think the book, in one sense, provides at least an answer, if not the answer for that. Because the book is essentially, as I said, about the foundational impasse of Zionism as a settler colonial project and the forms of sort of refusal that have kept it at impasse or as impasse, right? And that therefore have pushed its sort of core structural contradictions into new forms. Zionism is at a foundational impasse because, in my reading, it's defined by the stuntedness of its conquest. It's a project unable to transition beyond the violence of its making, of its originary moment. So it's a project that is unable to move from the foundation of order to the maintenance of order. And so the very drive of the project towards a kind of self-realization is stunted. And I'll come back to this. Israel is, of course, established as a racial majoritarian or a sort of racially defined Jewish state. It finds itself today governing over some 7 million native non-Jewish subjects. That's about half or more than half of the population it governs. But this is an irreducible contradiction at some point, right? And I think it's felt acutely by the state as a kind of impasse. So from the standpoint of a sort of racially defined state that feels besieged by a population it can neither absorb nor fully defeat, genocide is not simply a sort of vindictive exercise, nor is it entirely illogical from that standpoint. Right? It is, in my reading, a sort of corrective return to a block pathway. It's a search for a way out of the impasse. And the book is really, and what I want to talk about today, is the impasse or the impasses, right? And how they might be read historically and conceptually. And here, the question of time, in my reading, is paramount. Because at the core of the sort of claims in the book is that settler colonialism is always as much a conquest of time as it is a conquest of land. It is everywhere, I argue, a particularly, in some ways, even peculiarly fraught struggle over time. Settler orders everywhere rely on the creation of new beginnings, on sort of beginnings that wipe the slate before them in ways that will exclusivize historicity, yes, the return to history in Zionism. And they will also mark the start of new civilizational and sovereign time. Thomas Paine's Birthday of a New World, right, or settler declarations of independence. In the anti-colonial tradition, I think it was Frantz Fanon that probably sort of picked up on this most perceptibly. He gives a fairly important speech, I think, in 1960 in Accra, Ghana, a speech that was in part a sort of a subtle critique of Nkrumah. But in this speech, he describes colonial violence as three-dimensional. And two of the three dimensions are about time. He says the first dimension is violence in everyday behavior, so the sort of eruptive but also suspended violence of the encounter. But the other two dimensions are violence, he says, against the past. The past is emptied of all substance, and violence against the future, because the colonial regime presents itself as necessarily eternal. In The Wretched of the Earth, he gives us a slightly literary twist. The colonists, he says, make history and they know it. They are, he says, invested with beginning. Right? We made this land. And so their life is an odyssey or an epic, right? Whereas native life, he says, is listless. It's defined by custom and habit. What I want to add to this is that if the colonists make history and know it, they are also dogged by that history's vulnerability. Settler orders remain dogged by questions of foundation and time. They remain orders that even centuries after their foundation remain stricken with enmities and anxieties that open up all the time. And my claim in the book is that this sort of fraught struggle over time is nowhere sort of more acute than in the question of Palestine. Right? Israel, as I said, is a settler colonial project, if you want, defined by its inability to move past the past. If you want, it is a struggle in a certain sense between a political order that seeks to close time and the past in regimes of law and property that might render dispossession, removal, and indeed today even genocide a sort of mere technical formality, and practices of refusal and return that seek to deny that closure, that seek to deny the transition to a presentist regime of law and property, and that seek to keep that time of foundation open. that's how I'm reading here, the kind of the core of the struggle. So in the book, I grapple with this by telling the history of the Palestinian refugee camp as a political object. Right? I argue that it is in the camps that emerge, and I'll say a little bit more about them in a second, that emerge in the fallout of the eliminatory violence of the state's founding, that we can read this struggle over time. And so the camp is a kind of object and method, right? It's, if you want, a sort of epistemic point of view in which you can read global relations of force in what otherwise appear as or might appear as local sites. So to give you a kind of brief overview of the context, there are today about 58 official UN-administered or UNRWA-administered refugee camps in the region. The vast majority are established after the Nakba in 1948, 1949, after the ethnic cleansing of about 800,000 Palestinians from Palestine. There's a significant number that you would have seen on your screen a second ago that are established after the 1967 war produces another round of refugees, about 300,000. Most of them at that stage would have been twice displaced. In 1949, the Truman administration sends the head of the then Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, a guy called Gordon Clapp, who will head a mission to the region tasked with sort of finding a solution to the refugees and folding it into a sort of economic development plan for the region. And so within 3 quick months, he makes a recommendation to the General Assembly, and they inaugurate the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. It was meant to last all of 2 years, just to give you a sense of how sort of interim and temporary it was. And indeed, it still has its mandate renewed every 2 years by the General Assembly. And so the book follows the camp object across a series of archives, right? It tracks the camp. And in fact, each chapter more or less is written from one particular archive. So in the archive of the TVA itself, it brings with it a whole host of racializing presuppositions and assumptions that were forged in the TVA's encounter with Black life in the American South. Assumptions about idleness, about the unreadiness for self-government, assumptions about work as a moral corrective, as a necessary moral corrective that will shape the camp regime, right? It's a kind of history, a strand of history that goes directly into it. In the archives of the UN agency, UNRWA, for which the camp regime will both become a site of a sort of very particular technocratic authority that it will call administrative authority, but also the site at which that authority breaks down, presaging in some ways the technocratic turn that will follow. In the archives of the Palestinian Revolution in the 1960s and 70s, for whom or for which the camp will be the very sort of fateful object upon which the fate of the revolution rests. Either they're able to turn the camps from sort of immobilizing spaces of incarceration into communal spaces of forward movement, or the revolution will not happen. And in the archives of the Israeli state, which in the 1970s and 80s and into the 90s was haunted by the camps and saw in the camps its own anxieties of permanence, such that it would spend decades trying to undo the camps. And the work I want to share today comes from this last archive, because I think it speaks to the sort of core claims of the book probably most directly. And so it's about the place of the camps in the Israeli state's imaginary and practice. In particular, I look at a 20-year period, more or less, 1967 to 1987, or the early 90s. Start of the military occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, in which the camps become sites of sort of repeated state planning and intervention by the Israeli state that were all aimed one way or another at undoing the camps, at entirely sort of, if you want, decamping the camps, right? Now, of course, the resettlement of the Palestinian refugees, that is the sort of movement of the Palestinian refugees, their permanent emplacement in places outside of historic Palestine, had been a long-running sort of aim, priority, one could even say obsession of Israeli policy. It was a policy that ran for decades. It involved huge amounts of money, rafts of organizations. From the 1940s to the 2000s, almost every sitting Israeli government takes a shot, one way or another, at resettling the refugees, taking these refugees and permanently emplacing them somewhere else. So much so that minister without portfolio at that time became effective code for Minister of Refugee Resettlement. But The occupation of the West Bank and Gaza gives this sort of much broader policy a singular site of focus. So between, if I just to give you a sense of this, between the late 1940s and the late or mid 1980s, there are about 20 official, many more semi-official, broad Israeli plans for the complete resettlement of the refugees. But the vast majority of them come up after 1967. And the focus almost exclusively in those plans that come after 1967 will be on the camps themselves and on the refugees that inhabit the camps. Right? So the ones that are green or yellow, I can't tell what that is on your screen, are the only ones that actually get implemented. And here, of course, the emphasis almost entirely, if not, overwhelmingly at least, is on Gaza, it has to be said. And that's because Gaza is majority refugee, about 80% refugee. And the Gaza Strip, of course, is itself an artifact of the Nakba, right? It doesn't exist before 1948. So the focus is very much there. In the chapter, I ask, what is it about the camps that makes them such objects of anxiety and intervention? Why the camps? Why such a sort of singular focus on the camps, right? We know that Palestinian refugees embody what is, for Zionism, perhaps the biggest of all counterclaims, or the most threatening of all counterclaims, which is the claim to return. A return is Zionism's sort of master haunting. It's the political anathema of the state. Because return is the grounds of the reversibility of the project. So return is the big threat. But given that the vast majority of refugees in the region live outside of camps, what is it about the camps themselves, qua camps, that multiplies and concentrates this threat? Why do they go after the camps so sort of obsessively in this period? Why is so much energy and destructive power and money expended on undoing the camps and resettling, moving their population, sometimes moving them just a few hundred meters or yards outside of what were the camps? What do we learn? What do we learn from the practices, from the visions, from the calculative logics at play in this period? And what I want to argue is that this history of the camp in Israeli state practice gives us an insight into the struggle over time here. Gives us a certain insight into what I'm trying to say the core of the settler colonial sort of conflict is here. Because it tells us something about how the settler project here saw the camps both as one of the causes of its temporal bind, or what I call in the book the sort of vanishing horizon of its permanence. It sees a certain causality in the camps, and it sees a way out in the camps. It sees a sort of a short sort of circuit, a quick fix in the camps, a way out of its temporal bind, out of this irresolution, right? A certain shortcut to permanence in undoing the camps. And I want to turn to these perceptions now. Consider this sentence by an ostensibly left-wing Israeli politician in 1972 as he proposed from the ranks of the opposition a plan for the complete undoing of all 27 camps in the West Bank and Gaza. He says, "It is clear that the camp inhabitants are the hardcore of the problem." Or take this near identical statement made 20 years later by an ostensibly left-wing Israeli journalist who writes, "The refugees of the camp are, of course, the core of the problem." In certain Zionist political discourse, variations of this statement about the camps as the core of the problem is so commonplace as to be entirely banal. But if we suspend the confident certitude, the "of course," or the "it is clear" for just a moment, we might ask, what core of what problem exactly? For Danny Rubenstein, the celebrated and award-winning journalist who gives us this latter iteration, the answer is not quite direct, but clear enough. He writes, and this is the block quote here: "In the refugee camps, the consciousness of exile and the maintenance of customs for sustaining the bonds of the clan and the original village are naturally far more compelling. In their unrelenting misery, the residents of the camp live on a combination of nostalgia for the past and illusions about the future. Sometimes it seems as though the present is of no import to them." These lines are from Rubenstein's book, The People of Nowhere, The Palestinian Vision of Home. acclaimed as its blurb tells us for its remarkable empathy and depth of understanding. I bring up Rubinstein's book because it points, however obliquely, to a consistently present understanding of the challenge posed by the refugee camp and its inhabitants as the core of the problem. At stake here, I want to argue something more than the perceived and engendered threat of the camp as a base of insurgent refusal, or even the racialized and classed image of their miserable but dangerous urban wretchedness. At stake is something that Rubinstein's sketch marks without fully elaborating, and which will come up again and again in the record. The camps are of a different and recalcitrant political temporality altogether. That is, the camps constitute not just unruly spaces, but the very basis of a consciousness of an unruly time. For Rubinstein, the very tense in which encamped refugees live seems a problem. Between past nostalgia, future illusion, and no present sits what he calls a consciousness of exile. And it's this consciousness that palpably irks him across the text. For the politician Dov Zakhin, who gave us the first iteration we began with, the language is, of course, uncannily similar. In the camps, he writes, the consciousness of being temporary refugees persists. Put differently, for the Israeli political order, the trouble with encamped refugees is that, in effect, they refuse the terms of settler time. That is, they refuse inclusion in a historical time inaugurated and defined not just by the necessity, but by the irreversibility of their own dispossession. This is the issue. Rubinstein's take finds a past echo in a fragment of one of Mahmoud Darwish's works. In Journal of an Ordinary Grief, one of his 3 book-length pieces of prose, Darwish recounts the reaction of an Israeli soldier upon entering a West Bank refugee camp during the 1967 war. And he writes, during the June War, many Israeli soldiers were surprised to find that Arabs have a memory and remember a homeland that was lost. What surprised them most was that children born after the loss of the country were still attached to it. An Israeli soldier related that when he went into one of the refugee camps, he discovered that people lived there exactly as they had previously lived in their villages. They were organized as they had been before. The villages were the same and the streets were the same. That soldier was shaking. Why? I could not comprehend it. 19 years have passed and they are still saying, we are from Bir Saba. The camp here then is a site of counter-temporality that refuses inclusion into a dominant time. As a placeholder for the towns and villages of historical Palestine, what Rubinstein, of course, construes in an Orientalist fashion as a sort of primordial remainder, the bonds of the clan, the camp implicitly contests not just the settlements constructed atop the ruins of those towns and villages, but perhaps more fundamentally, the temporal sovereignty that is both the condition and effect of this settlement. Which is to say, the camp exists not just outside this time, but also in opposition to it. What Darwish shows us is that Israeli state politics understood this quite intuitively, understood it to the point that the soldier was shaken, or to be more precise, we could say was unsettled. To the soldier's bemused, almost naive question, why? The answer of Israeli political policy seems to have been because of the camps. It was the camps themselves that kept this anomalous political temporality alive. And indeed, the archival documents abound with statements in which officials give the camps a sort of effective, at times even agentic capacity, such that they are witnesses or evidence or reminders or instruments. We have to understand then the state's relationship to the camps within the wider politics of memory and time here. And in particular with what we might call the negational stance with which the Israeli state has met the memory and land claims of dispossessed Palestinians. This negational stance is probably best exemplified in the infamous and well-known statement made by Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir in a 1969 interview with the Sunday Times when she said, and I'm quoting, "There was no such thing as Palestinians. It was not as though there was a Palestinian people in Palestine considering itself as a Palestinian people, and we came and threw them out and took their country. They did not exist." End quote. Now, this statement is not exactly a disavowal of Palestinian presence as such, but this presence rendering in negative in a manner completely consistent with a broad stance in colonial history. Not a people, not a culture, not a sovereignty, not a nation, and so on. To Palestinians, this negational statement, "you do not exist," has always been a double injunction. To not only forget that you were ever here, but also to remember that in reality, you never were. So a kind of grammatically operatic double negative. Do not forget you were never really here. What is demanded then is a radical self-negation, not of a particular subjectivity, but of collective subjectivity as a whole. It's not good enough to forget a place or a homeland. One has to realize that one never really knew or possessed it to begin with. There is nothing to return to because there was nothing really there to start. But we don't need Freud to tell us that nothing comes from nothing. Engendering the nothing, filling the nothing up, making sure the nothing is recognized as nothing is hard and recursive work. It's not enough to overlay existing memory with official archival history or to target the minds of those in the state's schools through curricula and pedagogy. Settler politics also sought out the very geography itself. Right? It sought out the places of time and memory. It changed place names in a sort of frenetic concern with toponymy. It transformed ecology, devastating indigenous flora and fauna. And perhaps most strikingly of all, it erased Palestinian villages, towns, and city centers, and then covered the ruins and rubble with either trees and parks, or else cordoned them off into sort of fenced archaeological sites of abstract mythic history. It is the Palestinian ruin that has received the sort of most attention, and I think in scholarship, as a sort of object of haunting. But I think this underlying political anxiety, this sense of an oblique but imminent danger, is very much there also in those built forms that kept a material connection to the originary villages and to the time of return, which are the camps. The camps, as I mentioned, become a direct object of sort of thought and intervention after 1967. And I'm going to turn briefly to some of these plans. And broadly speaking, we can categorize three broad types of interventions. I'm only going to speak briefly about one, but all of them revolve around the concepts of the permanent and the normal, around permanence and normality. The words permanent and normal, or their cognates and synonyms, are by far the most reoccurring words in the historical record here. They just come up again and again and again. And there are sort of I mapped out three broad types of interventions. The first were sort of unrealized megavisions and master plans, these kind of fantastical plans and desires for the kind of one clean swoop or one clean fix that would undo all of the camps of the West Bank and Gaza in one blow, and that we'd resettle. So the 1969 Weitz Plan is a sort of example of that. The second type of intervention, and something that actually does get implemented, are cheap mass housing projects. So the Israeli state over the course of the 70s will build up, again, especially in Gaza, series of large housing projects. Aesthetically not too different from the camps. They don't move away too much from that. But the logic here is turning the refugees into property holders, or as they would put it, into landlords with a sort of, that would normalize their condition. But by far the most prevalent form of intervention, and probably what was most telling, was camp demolition and camp clearance. The clamor to do something about the camps was just too strong and too urgent to be restricted to planning or housing projects. Alongside all of these projects, often as their very scaffolding, was always the more radically eruptive violence of demolition and clearance. In the summer of 1971, the Israeli army, facing stubborn insurgency in Gazan camps, embarked on what called thinning out operations in the camps, or what then Israeli Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, euphemized as letting light into the camps. This started and peaked in the sort of summer of 1971, had another kind of peak in the first months of 1972, and then had another third intense phase in 1976. What's important here is that though security as ever was often the pretext, the specter of return and explicit anxieties around the temporality of the camps were paramount, right? They rise to the surface of the historical record with total ease. You don't really need to scratch very far to have it articulated in those terms. For example, in the summer of 1971, as the army was clearing dozens of homes in Jabalia camp in northern Gaza, one army commander spoke to the Times of London. He said that the security roads being bulldozed through the camp, and I'm quoting here, go straight through Lidda, Jaffa, and Haifa. These are the ethnically cleansed Palestinian cities of historic Palestine, the main former urban centers of Palestine. Around the same time, the defense minister, Agan Dayan, would echo the sentiment, understanding camp demolition as an extension of the original conquest, saying, and I'm quoting, as long as refugees remain in the camps, their children will say they come from Jaffa and Haifa. If they move out of the camps, the hope is they will feel an attachment to their new land, end quote. Another official, also speaking to the Times in 1971, went further. He directly makes the connection between camp clearance and time and consciousness, explaining to a reporter that clearance and demolition had the purpose of, quote, re-education for the refugees. He said, we want to teach them to wake up to 1971. These statements are, in my opinion, striking and go to the heart of everything with incredible precision. For one, clearing the camps is explicitly necessary for the completion of the conquest. Right? Without conquering the camps, you haven't really fully conquered the cities of historical Palestine. But two, camp clearance is also a temporal corrective that works at the level of subjectivity itself. The demand to return, again figured as a sort of irrational dream or illusion, often an infantile desire incubated in the camp itself, has to be met with camp clearance as a means of educating the dispossessed to their proper place in time. So it is a means of waking them up from their dreamy slumber, bringing them into line with the present as reality. So if for Rubinstein in the reading we began with, the problem was that the present is of no import to them, as he said, then the military's response was to raise their houses so that the present might be imported straight into their consciousness. And so the bulldozer here is a device not just for the clearance of built structure, it is also a device for the clearance of consciousness itself at some level. Okay, I want to step back from this history now. That's the fragment I wanted to share. And by way of beginning to wrap up, thinking about this in the sort of broader terms I began with. How should we understand this history? What did the 20 odd years in this period, of course, a history that's unfinished, but what did the 20 odd years worth of these schemes achieve? Eventually, by the end of the 1980s, about 10,000 homes were raised in the Gaza Strip. About 40,000 people were displaced. Israeli officials themselves bemoaned that this didn't even meet the natural rate of population growth in the camps. So by its own measure, at least, camp undoing or decamping failed. And yet, the sense of anxiety and the sense of strategic necessity to which camp removal was responding, which says that at some level the completion of the project demands the undoing of the camps, is still very much with us. We can see it in the genocide, which has poured so much of its violence onto the camps. And of course, Gaza is majority refugee. And we can also see it in the West Bank, in which in the last year, 2 camps have been almost entirely cleared. In keeping open a time and subjectivity that contested the givenness and finality of dispossession, the camps were and are still seen as a challenge to the variability of the state to transition beyond its foundational moments. Let me unpack this a little. If we accept Patrick Wolf's now emblematic, but also, of course, problematic shorthand definition of settler invasion as a structure and not an event, it is a structure, I would add, and that we should keep in mind, and here I think people like Wolf are on firmer ground, it is a structure with a specific endpoint. That is, settler colonial orders are characterized by a persistent drive to ultimately supersede the conditions of their operation. In structural terms, and I think we do need to think structurally here, every settler colony seeks its own self-supersession. That is, settler colonial orders ultimately seek to move toward, even if they never accomplish, not just the elimination of the native, but the nativization of the settler, such that the latter becomes a strictly historical political category. Grant Farid calls this a form of domestication. He says, intent on rooting itself against the temporal force of history, as it were, into the land. The drive towards self-supersession has to overcome and surpass the lived past. This is where the Zionist project stands out. Not, and I need to be clear here, not because it is less successful or complete than other settler colonies, such that it is somehow a reflection of an American or Australian past. This, I think, is nonsense. Dispossession is not a done deal anywhere, and settlement everywhere, again, to quote Farid, marks a kind of infinity because it represents, due to its foundational past, to its foundational violence, the time that will not and cannot be passed away. Farid says the settler is a bearer of a fatal temporality. It's not something that can ever really be undone. And I think part of the weakness of settler colonial studies here in this regard is how much it's relied on a narrative, maybe even an epistemics of sort of finality and triumph. I don't mean this at all. Rather, what I mean is that the Israeli project stands out because it is more stuck. Stuck, not just as I mentioned, with a native population that makes over half of the population it governs, but also stuck with a blunt set of political instruments that themselves belie its claims and its desire to transition. Formal apartheid and the legal distinction between citizenship and nationality, military occupation, states of siege, severe restrictions on the freedom of movement, continuous warfare, and now protracted genocide, and maybe more tellingly, its systemic, extra-legal, and its reliance on systemic and extra-legal discretionary settler violence, i.e. the frontier mob. Now, one can and should make the argument that every settler order initially relied on the frontier mob and then retroactively legalized dispossession. All right, the theft that retroactively becomes property. But in most cases, this legal and temporal gap is eventually closed. And you can also argue that it is not entirely closed. One can easily make the case that gun culture and gun violence are themselves an entailment of the unfinishedness of the frontier in North American history, but it changes. It has to change. Zionism, by contrast, has never been able to close that gap. So even the move to market and capital-based forms of management is stunted, not least around land, where dispossession is unable to actually transform land into a fungible private property relation. Most of the land, over 90% of all land, is still owned by the state and public bodies. In turn, all the positive instruments of elimination are here foreclosed. Assimilation, native citizenship, the transformation of title into individual freehold. Foreclosed too, of course, are the arguably more cunning liberal procedural instruments of settler colonial management, like the politics of recognition or apology, or heaven forbid, the land acknowledgement. And so Israel remains reliant on open sort of orders of violence on magnitudes that set it entirely apart. This is where we have to locate the camp question. Because camp and colony are entangled from the start, co-produced in this double movement of dispossession and replacement. Twinned but inversed topologies. Zionism both imagined its conquest as a civilizing, metropolitan, and engineering enterprise that faced at best encamped nomads, and at the same time, in a kind of performative engenderment, produced the refugee camp through dispossession and expulsion as the settler colony's irreducible foil. Yet if the camp is not just the result of this originary dispossession, but is also, as I've been arguing, in its very material endurance, part of what keeps that time of dispossession open and unresolved, then it is both effect and interruption of colonial settlement. In keeping counterclaims alive in this consciousness of the temporary, it keeps open the foundational violence that the settler colony needs to render into a past. Even a wrongful past, if need be, in which mistakes were made, but a past nonetheless that is extrinsic from the present. Instead, the camps as placeholders for the vanquished but recoverable geographies of Palestine persist as a set of claims not only to a pre-settler past, but also to a post-settler future. The camp doesn't simply mark this time. The camp is, in a very real sense, this time that will not and cannot pass. So by keeping this past unfinished and the question of time open, the camp sits at the heart of the impasse that I'm saying defines this project. Okay, I want to make a final remark about this time beneath the concrete, and I want to sort of shift out a little bit beyond the camps, and this will be the last thing that I say. this time is not simply an abstraction, right? It can sound like an abstraction when I'm sitting here talking about it in these words, but it's not. It's a socially lived time. We can call it, just for now, if you want, unoccupied or Palestinian time. The camps mediate this time, but it exists and it's sort of, or manifests in a host of political practices and forms of life in and out of the camps. We see it, for example, in the politics of memory and memorialization that hold on to place names and geographical knowledge against the state's push. We see it in the cultivation of native wildlife and agriculture. We see it in the practices of return and the sort of lived relationships, not the sort of symbolic relationships, but the lived relationships to the villages, to what in English we call ruins, but in Arabic we just call villages. We see it in the inhabitation and the rebuilding of ruins and demolished structures, the almost immediate reemergence of everyday life in the rubble. We saw it very strikingly, I think, this past January in the images of the return of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to the northern Gaza Strip after that first ceasefire was called, reversing in a few hours a plan of forced removal that had been implemented over 16 months of totally limitless annihilatory war. I'm referring to these images. These images of some of the poorest people on earth emerging from months of sheer horror, emaciated from starvation, bedraggled, surrounded by nothing but rubble, returning to nothing but rubble, in the knowledge that this rubble would likely become rubble again. But still somehow defiant, still smiling, still carrying their kids and their cats and walking back to their homes against arguably the combined force of the entire global racial order. So was, of course, a return, was also the first reversal of mass expulsion and ethnic cleansing in Palestinian history. There is something to me almost unfathomable about this event. How does one parse it? How does one explain it rationally, as it were? And in posing this, I'm fully aware of the risks of romanticizing an image like this, or lionizing it, or even celebrating it somehow. It's a risk because it's not only that the loss is just too great, and it's a risk not only because these people are still being starved and bombed and slated for death and removal. It's also a risk because Palestinians should not have to keep performing unfathomable heroics just for the rest of the world to take note and recognize a mutual humanity. They don't exist just to confirm for the rest of us the intolerability of this world or to remind us of what makes a life worth living. I don't intend this then as humanizing somehow or even as an appeal to a counter-humanism. I don't know what value that has now. But I do want and must recognize this persistence of forms of life that are, as Abdul Jawad Omar put it, simply beyond the horizon of violence. There is a form of life that exists beyond the horizon of violence. That is to recognize what Samira Ismail calls the destructible life that is in excess of genocide. Not the life after genocide, but the life that proceeds despite genocide. And the only way I've been able to conceptualize or think about this event is as a kind of refusal grounded in this unoccupied or Palestinian time, this time beneath the concrete that I'm talking about. That is to realize that these are people that do not live in the sovereign new time of the colonial state or the global order that ordains it. A time in which they exist only in the past perfect tense, a time in which they have already been defeated and already accepted their loss and already moved on and already recognized their dispossession as final, a time in which they are but a footnote in Zionism's, which is to say the West's redemptive and triumphant post-war history. Instead, they inhabit their own time, a time that bulldozers can't reach, a time that holds on to a set of truths that seem utterly implausible in the present, but that they somehow, nonetheless, know to be true. A time that refuses to consider the settler project as anything more than temporary, no matter how built up it gets, no matter how powerful it gets, no matter how much catastrophe it is capable of administering. And that, I think, is the secret of their power. It's not in any decisive finality. They simply don't have the power to deliver a knockout blow to genocidal settler colonialism or to the global imperialism that underpins it, but they have the power to refuse it victory. They have the power to keep time unsettled and the future open. And in that regard, I think we all owe them an eternal debt. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your time.